It fits. So, good afternoon. Peter Fox from RPI, and thanks again to Fiona for the invitation for this session. Well, secret, she always invites me to these sessions to be provocative and potentially to be a little annoying. That's why I'm going last, to hopefully stimulate a little bit of discussion. So I took on the title of the session itself, the Research Data Ecosystem, which you've been really well introduced to now by both Fiona and Kirsten. I just want a quick check. Has anyone read a paper that I wrote with Mark Parsons called "Is Data Publication the Right Metaphor?" Apart from Gail. Thanks, Gail. So down the bottom there, and if you just do a web search on "Is Data Publication the Right Metaphor?" It came out in the World Data System Conference Proceedings. It was published in the Data Science Journal, and it was largely motivated by our desire, as data has become more and more important to a variety of stakeholders. You've heard about them, but publishers in particular. There's this very strong desire to just wholeheartedly adopt the publication approach. And we call it a metaphor because it's not the same as actually making data available. And we wanted people to take a long look at that, question that metaphor, and see if it was the right one. And our aim is to generate a lot of discussion, and we haven't generated much. So, except among our internal colleagues, we're still fighting about these things. So I just want to encourage you to sort of maybe take a look at that paper. It's more of an essay. It's not a highly technical paper. But I want to just get you going a little bit, just so we can ground it in the reality of scientific data. And you can, Dilbert pretty much covers most of it. Between Dilbert and XKCD in the scientific world, we can't reach aid. What should we do? Well, we just make up some data like everyone else does. And then we sort of institute this cyclic reinforcement. And that's the bit that's coming under a tremendous amount of scrutiny. Now, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but the public is starting to care about the money that they're putting into the data that we generate and the conclusions that come from them. And this is not new. If you think the attention to this is new, it's not. At least for 10 years at the International Council for Science, which is the international body that oversees scientific unions and a variety of other activities, I was on a variety of committees that came forward with reports around statements regarding data. One of those statements was the just adoption of the OECD guidelines. And if you haven't seen those, I'd encourage you to look those up. Specifically as they relate to data access and also data sharing. And they're largely based on open access, and you should all be familiar with the subtlety of what open access actually means. And then more recently, so it's more than 10 years ago, and recently there have been organizations that you've heard about, such as the Research Data Alliance, which is also an international organization that's wholly taking on this data sharing call to action, really. And they're a part of an ecosystem, data sharing, data access, data citation. They're part of an ecosystem, and that's going to be one of the themes. Many of you also have taken note if you watch things going on in the United States, but it was also true in the United Kingdom more than 2 years ago. This openness of research results is now flowing into, this is a memo from the Executive Office of the President, of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, about open data policies, managing data and information as assets, which should be retained and used in a good way. And largely the response of the research community is that these are very big sticks that are being waved at the community, because by and large there is not extra money going into responding to these mandates, and these are mandates. So I'm not a stick person, I'm a carrot person. And I think we just need bigger carrots. So we need to look more broadly, and that's why I like to sort of break out of the metaphor of data publication as it relates to traditional publications. And recognizing that these committees and councils that met, there's another recommendation, is that the scientific community should engage actively with publishers of all kinds together, and with the library community and scientific researchers to document, promote community practices in the handling of supplemental material, publication of data, and appropriate data citation. And this conversation has actually started through professional societies, through conferences such as this, and that's why I always accept the invitation to come and provoke you a little bit, get you thinking. And why? So why here is a slide that I borrowed from a colleague coming up to 10 years ago. And you can read it. It says, data has lots of audiences, and there's this sort of famous use of a pyramid here. And the base of the pyramid is always something like very broad attention to the scientific public is interested in data, museums are, educators, public is interested in it, commercial organizations, this is for NASA, but as you go further and further up into decision making, and I'll give you an example of decision making in a minute, it becomes more and more strategic, right? So when you get at that pointy end of the pyramid, that's where it becomes really important. And there's some text you can read on the side, but the really important thing is, where are the scientists in this? Well, the scientists are actually being crushed at the bottom of this pyramid because of all of these demands that are flowing in for access to the data, for extra documentation on their data, and so on. So just keep that in mind. The ecosystem has all of these stakeholders and potentially more. So here's my goal. My goal has been for the last 5 years is to make data. So you'll recognize the person on the right. Does anyone in this room not recognize that character? Fantastic. See, when I teach this to my students, out of 63 students last semester, 3 of them knew who this was. And I won't go into the reason why I use this image of Lieutenant Commander Data, but in my opinion, he was Gene Roddenberry's and the Star Trek creators' envisionment of a data scientist. And if you think a little bit into that, data sort of embodies the ability to pull back and aggregate data and credit sources and lead to decisions and things like that. But the real thing is, it goes further than that, is data as a first-class object. So if you're a publisher, or if you're an author, the first-class object is the paper. All right, and data is 4th, 5th-class citizen. And the goal here from a research data ecosystem point of view is to elevate data as a first-class object. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that it's a subject of conversation, that you have a conversation around data rather than writing a discourse around it, which is how we write papers. And the way in which metaphors come into this, and I won't go into a long explanation of metaphors, but you all use them every day, in and out. And there are many metaphors for achieving this goal of data as a first-class object. And they, of course, depend on who you are and what your worldview is and what your stake in the pie is, including bias. If maybe if you're out to make money versus out to increase your reputation, or out to comply with a mandate that you've been given. So that's our goal, but we're not quite there yet. And we're having conversations just like the one today about data plus X, where X is citation, publication, integration, ownership, trust, policy, privacy, ethics. That's all going on right now in the community. And once again, if you don't know Unix, down the bottom there, the / means here. The / means everything above us. The / means everything below us in our own organizations and the people we know. And / is the world. That's the root. All right, and there's Calvin, of course. Can't go far without putting Calvin in there. So it's a conversation, and that's why I want to sort of get you thinking about a conversation that we can have, hopefully, in the last 30 minutes of this session. So I'm going to tell you what I think of as a metaphor. The metaphor I want you to think about is the ecosystem metaphor. You may be familiar with that word, but ecosystem is a real thing. It's about ecology and living things and growing things. And how would you apply that to data? Well, here's a complicated slide that usually I take 30 minutes to explain. I'm not going to explain it very much at all. But the idea here is that it emphasizes there's an ecosystem. Data is actually distinct, but sometimes overlapping with information. information, so this is information because it's been consumed by a person. A graphic, a table, something like that is information, a hand-drawn diagram, and knowledge on the far right-hand side. And in fact, what's important about this diagram, apart from the attributes that you see below these ellipses here, is A, that they overlap, and B, that you can derive data from information. You can derive information from knowledge, or knowledge from information, or in fact, you can derive data from knowledge. So it sort of wraps around, but that's really hard for you to visualize, so I don't do it that way. And the first time that data can become information is when you give it a context, that little green text down the bottom there. So that's the part of the ecosystem. So publishers, I would say, and authors think about publishing knowledge. And they include graphics, tables, other diagrams, that's information. And the call now is to unlock the data. But of course there's a very vast amount of data that's already in use in this ecosystem when we conduct research every day, when we teach our students. And then overlaid on that are the producer and consumer ellipses, which I want to prod you on in a little bit. So the metaphor is that it's an ecosystem, and there are many considerations, but I think of it as a framework for talking about data and the other things that go with it. Excuse me. So now if we just drop out the data and information, I want to focus on producers and consumers in a particular way. And thank you very much. So on the ellipse on the left, the producer ellipse, the way in which you think about things like data is you think about asserting quality of it. I think it's this good. My algorithm tells me it's this is the statistical uncertainty. And when you do that, you have an idea of fitness for the purpose, and it's usually the original purpose. And you are an organization, which might be NASA, or it might be an individual citizen scientist collecting information about birds. But so you're the producer. On the right is the consumers. They don't necessarily think about quality control. They assess the quality for their own use. There's many factors that go into that, and they determine fitness for use rather than fitness for purpose. Can I use it? Does it suit my intent? And then I have to have sufficient information available to me to be able to trust. And so what's important, and this is why the library community is really important in this actual activity of moving things from producer space to consumer space, and given that they overlap, is called curation. All right? It's the active management for current and future use. And remember, the producers are involved in that and the consumers are involved in that. So when you're thinking about making data available in a publishing sense, you've got to think about this active curation. And that's where the burden is. This is the stuff that scientists, conventional researchers for the most part, don't really budget for and really don't want to think about, and that's where they're being forced to, and we want to sort of give them some incentives. So this is an ideal diagram. In reality, it looks actually a lot more like this. All right? So the separation between producer communities and consumer communities with an uncertain and scary little red star and a red question mark in the middle, that's really what happens, is this disconnect, and this is why it is additionally such a burden. We would, of course, like to turn that red into partially yellow or something like this, and this, in fact, may be you. It may be the publishers. In fact, the publishers and other organizations are trying to sit in this in-between space. Is that the right community? Should there be another set of organizations or even individuals in there? Maybe. So let me move on then and give you just one very quick example, and it's a topical one. The third US National Climate Assessment just came out, so it's a little bit busy, but I'm only really going to highlight one thing, and that is it's a comprehensive assessment of the state of the climate in the US, including impacts and consequences, and it's all of course based on a significant collection of researchers from a variety of different fields, and gathering together the best and most robust information and writing a report. And what's being requested, because fortunately we had ClimateGate, where it was brought into question as to whether the results in the international study were legitimate, the US Congress mandated that this national climate assessment should be clickable. Let's just use that word, verifiable. You better click through and find out where everything comes from in this report. So if you click on that figure in the top of the report there, it lets you find out which data set was used to generate that figure. It also tells you the agency, so the data set is the thing we're after, but also the agency that hosts it, the data center, the paper that it was published in, references to the journals, the authors, and the software that was used to create it. So this level of transparency that's now being demanded says there's a big ecosystem here, and it's not just the data, it's also the software, it's also the reputation of the authors, it's where it was previously published and perhaps not reviewed from a data point of view. So there's a large set of complex considerations that are going on here. So that's just one slide on the National Climate Assessment. Take a look. It's sort of a fun thing to do. Well, maybe not fun, but it's important. All right, so where are we? Doing all right. Part of the paper that Mark Parsons and I wrote was about metaphors, and I just want to pull out a little bit of that. This is one of the tables in there where we tried to characterize some of the existing metaphors that are listed across the top here. So data publication is considered, so it's the publishers thinking about releasing the data. We called it Big Iron. These are big data shops. There was science support, which is much closer to what Kirsten was talking about. Map making, linked data, a variety of these, and we analyzed them from a particular set of viewpoints, and we tried to be controversial, and only partially succeeded. So there's tables like this, and the one I want to highlight really, because I've got a really even more complicated slide coming up, is what's largely being proposed by my colleagues, and hopefully still friends after I finish talking in a few minutes, is a partnership between the data publishers and the data centers, and sort of separating and defining responsibilities, which is good. What I'm asking for is to sort of fully explore that space before we just say, hey, we should go do this. And it might be that it's right, but if it's wrong, we may not have as much time to fix it as we had with the scholarly process, which has evolved over 450 years, right? We probably don't have 450 years to fix the data release process. So, and there was someone sitting next to me at lunch, and I created this slide, and it's a little complicated because you haven't read the paper. But what we did in that paper was we looked at the pros and cons of those variety of approaches to making data available. So we looked at data centers, and we said data centers are good at these things, and they're bad at these things. And publishers are good at these things, and they're bad at these things. Bad meaning they don't, it's just not part of the remit. So what I thought is if you're going to have a partnership between data centers and publishers, can the disadvantages of data centers, which are on the left in bullets in black, be compensated by the things the publishers do well in red in parentheses after them. So that's the way you read this, is the black here is what the data centers are bad at, and the red is can the publishers actually compensate for that. That's just my first cut. I did this at lunchtime, right? So it's partially digested. It's fully beta, as you can see down here. And so the data centers typically have weak documentation, but the publishers have a simple procedure that's well tested and it's based on science norms, cultural norms, peer review. Data centers don't think very well about use. They sort of assume it's used. Whereas the publishers, have dissemination mechanisms and they shift the burden on tracking use. The roles for data centers are not well defined, the reputations are a little bit not well understood, whereas publishers have an imprimatur. They sort of take ownership for that and are respected. And so on, preservation, sometimes not so good with data centers, and publishers do think about things such as preservation. On the right then is the opposite, It's the disadvantages of publishers and this locked and static nature and this previously lack of machine accessibility could potentially be compensated for capabilities of data centers, such as data centers can reprocess things, they can make them much more dynamic, they're auditable, they're online. They often have this central authority and funding model that looks very different from a pay-for-service point of view. They don't think about it that way. And as you're probably finding out, from a publishing point of view, releasing data is not scalable, whereas for the data centers it is. So that's the sort of thing that I want people to really start thinking about. So it's about, and I've got how many minutes is? About a couple of minutes?
Yep.
So I'm just going to finish up then with sort of maybe setting the stage. So it's about contracts of all sorts, right? And we need to sort of sort out what those contracts are. What can I give for you? What do I want in return? So just a quick US agency, I think they're unnamed government example. This is their original workflow. I'm not necessarily going to go through it. But they have authors, they have complex arrangements before it goes to internal reviewers. They had metadata reviewers, they had peer reviewers, they had publication editors, they had approving officials, they have yellow signs with exclamation marks in it, and I helped them through this conversation about the contracts and the elements in the ecosystem, and we redesigned this and how this sort of, if you know the acronyms, you'll know immediately who this agency is. And they looked at release of data. A little bit more like you would release software as a suitable metaphor for how they go about it. And so, even so, authors, supervisors, metadata reviewers, and you'll see down here peer review. And this topic has come up already. And peer reviewer shows up in a number of cases, but the workflow is very streamlined. There are well-defined roles and responsibilities. And what became really obvious is that peer review, which was carried over from their publication mentality, doesn't make sense for data. And you've seen the checklist, right? Data review looks a lot more like the list that Fiona showed, not like traditional peer review. So, just in finishing up, there are many attributes that we want, desirable things we would like in this ecosystem. And my view is that we've got a bunch of attributes, in search of metaphors. And one of them is a much more loosely coupled one, which has sort of been present in the research data community for a while. So a paradigm of archive, release, and mediate that disaggregates the functions, whereas a publishing function is highly aggregated. And that's compared to a tightly constrained data center publisher model. We've got to think about how rapid we need to be, because there's a very strong call for rapid release of these results, and the fact that they're versioned and not final. And then, the software itself that sits around the data is a really important is an important part of this conversation. So I'm calling for this active mediation, this in-the-middle piece between the producers and the consumers. And maybe there's a new role in there that we haven't actually thought of very well. So this is the last slide. This is my call to discussion. There are multiple metaphors and many things that we can consider. The worst thing I think we could end up with, this is where I get to provoke you, is a predator-prey metaphor. So you all maybe learn about predator-prey relationships, foxes and rabbits. Well, there's only really two things in the ecosystem, right? That would be bad. That would be really bad. So we can have multiple solutions. It's complicated. But I'm okay with it being complicated. I think there's a tendency maybe to try and oversimplify it because it is a complex thing. Data review is not peer review. There's a nice paper by Matt Mayonek and colleagues that have just come out in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society about data review. And if you haven't read the data science journal essay, please do. We're always looking. We published it in open review, and we'd love people to sort of have a conversation around it. Thank you very much.